Right. Welcome, MetaDreamer, to the MetaView podcast.
Thank you, Peace. Glad to be on here. It's a long time overdue.
yeah, long time coming. Yeah, MetaDreamer here is one of my favorite people in crypto and probably one of my favorite people, period. And today, the topic we got is some real heavy shit. Like we had the serious topics in the past, like the meta crisis, but this one is by far the most serious we had ever. And like while meta crisis may be an existential threat to all of humanity in theory, like this crisis is actually killing millions of people pretty much as we speak. I've been told that we shouldn't even record this episode because it's tricky, it's dangerous, it's such a complex topic. You shouldn't try to do it. But I don't care. I want us to cover it. And I think MetaDreamer did a ton of research and got a good handle on what's actually going on, better than most media outlets, in fact. So, yeah, let's fucking do it.
Let's do it. Appreciate you, Peace. You're one of my favorite people too. And yeah, it's always interesting, this idea that, oh, it's complicated, oh, don't talk about it, when it's really not that complicated, especially with like social media. It doesn't actually take too much effort to look stuff up, and there's tons of people making like dopamine driven short form content to like educate you about everything that's happening. So it's I think that fear is kind of what's allowing this to continue so much. People would rather bury their heads in the sand, which is like pretty horrifying.
It's a painful
to think
topic,
about.
and it's like an anxiety-inducing topic, so people rather just like look away.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so yeah, let's introduce yourself a bit first. So like, yeah, what's your personal history like, and sort of how this affects you?
Yeah, so I was born in Canada, like first generation from my parents who immigrated to Canada from Pakistan. I was raised Muslim. I was born in like the 90s, so my early childhood, my kind of your first memories you get is like around like maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. I think it was like when I was 6 years old when 9/11 happened, and so I kind of grew up in the West under this kind of paradigm between these two worlds. My parents being Muslim and being raised as a Muslim, and then living in the West as all this kind of stuff is happening, and Muslims are kind of seen as enemy number one. It's like a pretty weird place to be in growing up, but I think that gave me a lot of context on both like how people in the West think, and the truth or reality of the matter in terms of like what Islam or is actually about, or what the Muslim world represents or stands for, and differentiating that between the kind of last 20, 30 years of geopolitical history kind of being defined by this US policing of the world. So that is kind of the history of me in terms of like why this topic kind of resonates a lot with me. Growing up, having being like everyone viewing you as the bad guy, or like on the bad team or whatever, and that kind of seeing everything that was playing out back then after 9/11, and then seeing everything that's playing out now, it just like rings a very strong bell with me. So that's why I kind of wanted to, or that's what kind of attracted me to like spend so much time learning about this. And once I learned about it, being kind of like shocked at how little people actually know about it, and just how brazenly bad the situation is. Like in the last few months is only when I've really gotten to know how bad it was, and I knew it was bad before, but because I didn't really spend the time to go deep and understand the history, however bad I thought it was like 100 times worse than that. And that's kind of what happens as learn more and more, and and it's not hard to learn too, because there's people like Norman Finkelstein, who's like a survivor of, or sorry, his parents were Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz, and he's spent his entire adult life studying Israel-Palestine and what happened there. And the things that he says is like, you wouldn't even imagine like that's actually what's happening, but that's someone who spent that much time learning it, and he has that stance that kind of like really shows you the nature of what's going on. So I think this whole thing is like one of the biggest coordination failures of all time, mostly due to information asymmetry. We always talk about coordination failure happening because of information asymmetry. So hopefully this can kind of help shed a light on that and make that less asymmetric.
Just before we get into the history and all of that, I want to just hear like a quick TLDR of what's going on, or like what the media says is going on, the mainstream media, and then what is actually going on. Like as short as possible.
So mainstream media says that everything going on started on October 7th, and Hamas went into Israel and killed all these innocent civilians because they hate Jews. And Israel now has to go into Gaza and get rid of Hamas so that they can, because that's self-defense, and they want to protect their civilians. And that's kind of the highlight summary of the mainstream / like Western perception of what's going on. The TLDR of what's actually going on is Israel is an ethno-supremacist state that has in its mission to take over the entire land of the Palestinians, in which they stole their land from after they were granted asylum and immigration, refugee status there after the Holocaust by the Palestinians in 1947. They killed a bunch of them and took over their land. And since then, it's been kind of continued occupation, denial of self-determination, and denial of basic human rights for the past 70 years. And because of that, Hamas, it's kind of 30 years after that initial, in 1947, it's called the Nakba. When that happened, Hamas was started like 20, 30 years after that, because all of their forms of protest or resistance or whatever were met with kind of violence and more killing and all that. So that's when they started resisting with military means, using violence back. And that's what happened on October 7th. Their mission was to go and grab as many hostages, civilian hostages or military hostages as they could, and use them to release Palestinians who were jailed in Israel wrongfully, including like children, teenagers who threw a rock at a tank. They get thrown into jail. Anyone with no trial or anything. There's like thousands of people in jail there wrongfully. So historically, that's what's worked for them to get those people back, is exchanging hostages. So that's what happened on October 7th. And we can go into detail more specifically on the events of that day and kind of the evidence in terms of what happened there versus what was said to happen there, and all that. But yeah, so that kind of shed a light on this whole thing, and now way more people are aware of what's happening. And the Palestinians, it just has like their ask is not that much. It's just like basic human rights. It's not too much to ask for. So instead of addressing that issue, most people are focused on the distraction that is Hamas, which Israel props up. And Hamas is something Israel needs in order to justify what its true goal is, which is ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians, from that whole area, from the river to the sea. And that's, there's, I think, like hundreds of statements that directly state that that's their goal. They don't say that's their goal to the Western audience in mainstream media, but they've made statements throughout history and in recent time as well that that's their goal is, removing everyone and destroying all of it. So that's, I guess, the TLDR, what's happening. And then, yeah, I'll imagine we'll get into the weeds.
Yeah, before we get into the weeds, I want to ask one less, a bit shorter question, which is, why is this relevant to Web3? Because, yeah, in Web3 people don't really talk about it, but
Yeah.
I think it is relevant.
Yeah. So, I mean, the entire purpose and ethos of Web3, let's say, it goes back to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, but even before that, it goes to like cypherpunks. Cryptography itself was the most powerful technology for freedom against, government surveillance and control of the masses. Cryptography is the only thing stopping the world from being just a complete propaganda state in terms of everything's controlled, everything's monitored, all that. So, and in terms of Bitcoin, that was created specifically as a protest against corrupt governments, stealing from the public by, so government, the kind of collaboration between the public and the private groups in terms of the government bailing out these corporations with trillions of dollars taken from essentially people who are paying taxes or who have the US dollar, so inflating, fiat currency. And so, Bitcoin was a thing that prevents from any government owning the money and the ability to create new money. And so the kind of core ethos of these things is anti-oppression from elites and powerful governments. And what's happening in Palestine is the worst case of oppression by elites and powerful governments using propaganda to manipulate the masses. And so, the victims, the reason why it's so important and relevant to everyone is because the victims aren't just the Palestinians, it's like every Jewish person who's been convinced that Israel is, their allegiance can only be to Israel, and that, essentially like brainwash a huge portion of people into supporting genocide. That's a horrific thing to do to people. All the people in the West who are, too afraid to talk about it or even look into it, like they're all victims too, because you're being severed from your own humanity, from realizing, the suffering of others enabled by your democratically elected governments, and kind of supported and allowed to proliferate because of your decisions to not engage with it. And so, people just, they hear the narratives, which is, oh, it's a complicated thing, it's very difficult to solve, like all these narratives. And so like that is like their buffer zone or justification to not engage with it or not talk about it. But all of that is like a facade. It's like a spider's web. You blow on it and it's gone. The solution is very simple, and the problem is very clear. And the only reason there's any confusion about it is because of the decades of institutionalized demonization there's been of Islam and Muslims and the Muslim world by like Western imperialist powers, specifically due to this collaboration between the public and private sector, where corrupt government elites and corrupt corporate elites collude to benefit each other against the will and to the detriment of the masses. So, this truly, it's like the strongest symptom of the overall problem in the world of elites versus masses. And that, I think, is the same problem that crypto and Bitcoin and cryptography was created, and the ethos behind that to solve. And I think these are the things that have the most potential to build towards that better world. And a lot of the time, change doesn't happen unless things get really bad and force people to change. And the situation is really bad right now. So that's why there's almost a moral onus on everyone to take this seriously and see it as an opportunity for radical change towards something better. And, you know, the cessation of like all, it's kind of it's like the festering wound from like the infection of a lot of evil stuff that's been happening throughout the last 80 years, you know, from like the Holocaust kind of defining, you know, the entire modern era up until then. The core problems of humanity can be summed up by, you know, a lot of those geopolitical conflicts throughout those times. And, you know, if you simply look at how much money is spent on war, you know, US military budget, you know, Israeli military budget, all of the spending that goes into that, and how different the world could be if that spending, even like 10% of it, was redirected towards like regenerative stuff or like public goods funding, all these things that would create such a better world. But, you know, obviously this is the nature of Moloch, like our inability to coordinate. So, you know, especially people like, I get it in the wider crypto space, but, you know, people in the crypto space should not be afraid to talk about this. Like this should be probably top of mind in terms of shit happening in the world. But specifically people in the DAO space who talk about Moloch and coordination failure, you know, it's I don't know how you can call yourself that and then not see the huge coordination failure happening here, and kind of, you know, falling victim to Moloch yourself in this way, or, you know, helping to dump more fuel on the fire of Moloch. You know, so it becomes like, what are the values you actually stand for? You know, do you actually stand for them, or is it just like a badge that you wear to, you know, align yourself or be the cool person in a group, you know, or a costume that you wear essentially? That's the question. So anyone who like aligns with these values, it's almost a moral onus on you to understand the situation and, you know, do the best that you can to try to make a difference. And, you know, the biggest thing that can make a difference is a shift in public perception towards this issue. You know, that's the only thing blocking, or that's the only thing enabling this to continue. You know, one call from the US president could end the whole thing. You know, Israel's only doing what it's doing because it's aided and abetted by the entire, you know, Western governments in Europe and, you know, North America. So those governments are democratically elected governments. So there's a moral onus on its citizens who, you know, those democratically elected representatives, they represent those citizens. So if these are what your representatives are saying, there's a moral onus on you to make a difference or a change in that, to then reflect what your opinion is, if you actually think this is wrong. And, you know, the scary part for me is how many people, after even I've shared the stuff with them, are still kind of set in their ways, and are basically kind of, you know, not saying it directly, but essentially saying that, you know, they really don't care about what's happening, or, you know, the human suffering that's there. And that's kind of, you know, a pretty dark thing. Like that makes me really sad, is that people have been so detached from their humanity that they can comfortably say things like that, and, you know, go on with their day.
Right. Yeah, it's tough for sure. What was I gonna say? Just let's get into the deeper history, I guess, of the conflict, how it all started. Maybe even back to the Jesus.
Back to Jesus. No, we're going before Jesus. We're gonna go all the way to. We're gonna go to Abraham. No Jesus.
I was gonna ask that as well, like the history of the religious involved, and how some people talk about like this as if it's a religious conflict.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk about the Holocaust. Then I also remember that the video of that woman from Israel who was talking about people shouldn't use the past genocide to talk about the current genocide, and she's like, oh shit, I just said this is a genocide. There's accidentally admitted it.
Yeah.
That was so funny.
It's funny because it was a Freudian slip, and there's been many of these in this situation. But the crazy part is like, they don't even have to be a Freudian slip. They can just actually say it directly, and it's been unquestioned. You know, that's the scary part, is like, when it comes out as like not even a Freudian slip. But yeah, I'm down to get into the history.